little bit of background on me. I taught high school for 8 years, and I taught high school kids who were kicked out of their high school. They were all suspended for either violence or severe bullying behavior, a whole bunch of, or just not going to school anymore. So I am very, very used to students who don't want to listen to me, who are very bored by what I say. And so I tend to try to make things more motivating and to also show people how you're actually learning, even when you don't realize you're not learning. So for some of you that have always been great students, you will probably find me very juvenile. You will think, why is she, going this far into things? That's just how I was trained. So for some of you that weren't always the best students, we'll be all right. We'll be okay. I also want to apologize. It sounds like the things that I must have sent, my last computer crashed and they were only able to save about half of my information. And this is a brand new computer, so I'm just getting to know it. It sounds like you all couldn't open my documents. Was anyone able to? I'll make sure I put those on again so you all will have it. So it's okay if you don't have any knowledge of what I'm talking about Buddhism in China. That slide told you that much. But it's okay if you don't have any of that information. This is the first session. I'll make sure all the other information gets to you, okay? The first thing I do when I teach, no matter what age, I always like to do a KWL chart. Has anyone seen these before? No one has seen these before. None of you got kicked out of high school. You all did really well in school. Do they have This is a really excellent chart. I like to do this for myself because I like to know what you already know. So for example, if I was teaching multiplication to a group of students, and I found out ahead of time that they already know, I'm not going to teach that anymore because they already know it. So it's really important for me, number one, to know any knowledge some of you already may have ahead of time. But at the same time, I have to say this isn't any kind of test to where if you have zero knowledge of the history of China, you don't make it up, you leave it blank. Because then I know, okay, they are exactly where I was when Don gave me this topic. Because I will be very honest, I'm ashamed to admit how I did not know anything about, I knew Buddhism came to China, and I knew the path it went, and that was all I knew. And I almost feel the more I learned, the more confused I got. So it was very important for me to give you a little tidbit of information. What I mean by that is I would start researching, and then I would be at the end of the research, and it would say, this is just a theory. We believe this is how it came. And then I would be like, oh, okay, scratch that, scratch that. Okay, and then I would read this, but we don't think it came this route. We think it came the Silk Road route. Oh, okay, so I mean there's a lot of different ideas of how it actually came into China. So I'm going to give you some of that information. But for those of you that are interested, it really was very interesting hearing all the different accounts of how they believe Buddhism has come to China. It's actually pretty amazing. You just can't get overwhelmed with it. So the first section is what do you know or what do you think you know? Because a lot of times students will think they know something and then we'll find out, oh, wait a minute, we really didn't know that correctly. So that's the first section, okay? And then the second section, the W stands for wonder. Is there anything that you're really interested in learning about Buddhism coming to China? There is a chance that what you're interested in I may cover today or in future sessions, but there's also a chance that you all may be interested in something that I wasn't planning on covering, and then that makes our classroom even more fun because then I can go research and we can all go research what we're interested in this moment. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm hoping you guys don't mind taking just 2 or 3 minutes. And if any of you are from China and you have a vast knowledge, or you've got your degree in Chinese history, I'm sorry this box isn't big enough. Just put a few things in there. So if you don't mind taking a couple minutes, the topic is Buddhism in China. This is class 1, because I'm going to give you these each time, just to kind of help us along. And then in the K section, anything you know or you think you know about Buddhism coming into China. And then in this, and if you have nothing, I'm not collecting these. And then in the middle section, anything that you've wondered about, now that you're thinking more, you're like, I'm very curious about this. Anything you're wondering about. If you have nothing, that's okay too. So I'll be quiet and give you about 3 minutes. Or are you afraid that you might be wrong? None of us are judging anyone. Yes, sir?
I know Buddhism was compared and contrasted a lot with Taoism and Confucianism when it arrived.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Yes?
Bodhidharma brought Buddhism into China?
I do have one of our sections, we talk that's a major section. We're not talking about that today. No, that is a huge part of the Buddhism in China outline. It was very hard to fit all of this into just 6 sessions. So it's hard to be concise, is what I'm sure a lot of you have noticed when you're trying to teach. It's hard to take all the information and make it smaller. Anyone else?
Well, I listened to a Dharma talk the other day, and he was talking about that exact topic. He said, Bodhidharma did not bring Buddhism to China, actually, and then that blew my mind. I realized how much I didn't know.
The one thing you'll definitely know by the time you're done researching is that there are many different theories and many different theorists that contradict each other. That's the big thing I learned from doing the research on it.
Well, many of the dharmas probably came over the Silk Road from monasteries that were part of the Dharmakutta school in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And some of the manuscripts that have been found there in the past 100 years or so, especially in the past 10 years, we're finding connections between them and the dharmas that are in China, so that they're becoming more certain that that's where some of the sutras came from.
It sounds like especially within the past 20 years is where they're finding a lot of historical artifacts to where they're being able to say more conclusively time period. So I think that we can find out even more as the time goes on. And they are finding quite a bit in Afghanistan.
Yeah, most of those appeared in the past 10 years. From the Bone Valley, especially.
You all have a lot of prior knowledge. Did you notice that? So if any of you out there are keeping your hand down and you've left your section blank, that is completely okay. You know, I came into it expecting no one to have any knowledge, so the fact that you have some is wonderful. Anyone else want to share before we move to the W? Yes?
I may have read from Osho, I'm not positive what the source is, but I learned that in his traveling, he traveled to a part of China that is now present-day China, and it's just kind of went north from there, and then it moved to Japan and so forth. Again, I heard it was Osho, but I'm not, I think it was Osho, but I'm not sure exactly.
And that may be something, that didn't come across in my research, but that would be a wonderful thing for you to see if you can find additional information on. We're so lucky to live in the age of technology. And I remember when I was young, I would have to go to the library and check out books and read the books. So I mean, we really are in a wonderful age. Now, at the same token, we have to make sure we get the correct information, you know, because just because something's on a website doesn't mean it's necessarily true. But that would be a really interesting thing.
I actually read it out of Osho's book, either Zen or The Buddha, His Life and His Teachings. It's, I think, one of those two.
It'd be interesting to, that's your homework. You have your
well, I have
own
those books,
homework.
so good.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll move to 1. wonder, any questions you've been wondering about? Maybe since we start talking, you're thinking of a question. What is something of a question that you may have regarding Buddhism in China? This part's really important for me because if it's something that I know that I'm not covering within the next 6 weeks, I can write that down and do some additional research on it, as well as you all can as well. So, any questions? Yes?
One of the other gentlemen mentioned Taoism, and I too have read them. So I was just curious about the similarities and the differences between Buddhism and Taoism.
That's excellent.
But I don't
touch
want
on
any
that
homework.
A little bit on the first, but not enough to where it would be a good idea for me to go back into that and at least give you a few bullets on each one. So thank you. Do I have a secretary that can write down notes that I'm going to research? Sherry, do you mind doing that? Thank you. Because I already promised you I wasn't going to collect your pages, so I can't go back on that now and say, give them to me. Yes.
So
Taoism versus Confucianism. Is that
Buddhism.
Buddhism versus Taoism, Confucianism? Yeah.
so Chan was founded in China.
Chan was founded in China. And we're going to do a lot of information. I mean, I actually think I'm doing 2 classes on that. So, I mean, there'll be a lot of information on that.
I'm sure you'll cover how the different emperors and their attitudes toward Buddhism and how that affected its spread or not.
Yes, that we won't get extensively into the different dynasties because it's a very, I mean, that's almost a separate class in itself.
Right.
But you're exactly right that some of the emperors embraced Buddhism, whereas other ones didn't. Excellent questions. Yes.
I know I'm going to be having to research this myself, but just in terms of the connection with China, just the connection with Mahayana and with the development of Mahayana, and, you know, where that happened, the connections between India and China, that timeline.
I barely touch on that today, but it is something that is in the plan. Barely touched on today. Yes?
Maybe something about Buddhism in China now.
That'll probably, for those of you that plan on doing this 2-year commitment, I think this year I only get to maybe like 600 or 800 AD because there's so much information. But for those of you that can hold on, then there's so much information, and especially even like in the 1950s, until modern day, there was so much information. So that will be next year. You guys can do it. Anything else?
I guess how does our understanding of this history affect us in terms of our practice as students and then as people who are training?
Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot in his books about whenever you're reading about anything, any kind of history, any kind of religion, spirituality, it's so important to put yourself, number one, in that day and time, you know, to remember what was going on. There may not have been the freedoms that we have in this moment at this time. And then number 2, to think about the past and decide how it can help you right now in the present. So I kind of like, anytime when Sharon, Patty, everyone has talked so far today, I take that advice and think, how can what they're saying help me right now in this present moment? But then I also like to go back and imagine being there in that time where the written word wasn't as important as the oral tradition, and how their memory had to be, I feel so much better than our memories are now because we are so reliant now on the written word. So it is interesting to think of those 2 things. Anything else before we move on? Those are yours to keep because at the very end you're going to see how much you learned because you can jot down some notes of what you learned. And please stop me at any point. Also, I am not claiming to be an expert on this at all. I'm exactly as Sharon said. I just started learning this a couple months sooner. Some of you may have a lot more information than I do. some of you may correct me on something. I may say something and it's incorrect. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Or if it's something you're not sure if what I'm saying is correct, maybe we can research it together between now and the next class. So don't be shy at all. You guys are very knowledgeable, so I want to make sure that I'm doing justice to this topic. Okay, one of the things I noticed when I was doing the research is that they seem to delineate between the traditional account of how Buddhism came to China and then a historical account of how Buddhism came to China. The historical account seems to focus more on the artifacts that they're able to find and date to where they can actually get exact dates of when this happens. Kind of reminds me of right brain, left brain people. Do you know what I mean by that? I am of the brain that history, data, I don't need that as much. So if someone tells me a story, I'm very interested in learning the story. But then other ones of us are like, I need facts. You're telling me this happened then, I need proof. Show me an artifact. So right now we're kind of going into both areas. So this is a traditional account that I was able to find. And I do have extra PowerPoint. I know some people are more of it, they like to have the paper in their hands, so I'll pass these out too if anyone wants those. Okay, this is Emperor Ming, talking about the, during the Han Dynasty, when we're talking about the emperors. Around the time of 58 to 75 CE, it is said, based on the traditional account, that he precipitated the introduction of Buddhist teachings into China. Does anyone know how? Before I go to the next page. You two don't count. You do count very much, but. And this is, of course, a picture in one of the museums of Emperor Ming. You know, it very well may not be accurate. Okay, Ming had a dream, and in his dream he saw a god who, as it was quoted, his body had the brilliance of the sun, and who flew before his palace. It was a very joyful dream in which he rejoiced. I should backtrack and say that all this is roughly about 2,000 years ago. That was the one thing that I was able to come up with. Not everyone agrees on the right time, but we're roughly going back about 2,000 years. I should also back up and say at the time during this Han Dynasty, people were deeply Confucianism. I didn't say that correctly. Confucianism was very deep in China. And for anyone who's not familiar with that, that's very much into harmony, family, and social. So that's what was going on at the time, as well as Taoism was the predominant religion as well. Emperor Ming, as I showed in this slide before, he was the second emperor of the Han Dynasty, and he was reported to be very hardworking, very diligent, and showed a lot of integrity. Had some issues with violence later on, which if any of you are interested in learning about, it's a very interesting story to learn about him and then his son, but seems to recover from that quite well. If you all want to add at any point, like I said, feel free. And so in this dream, he saw a golden figure, and some sources say that it was of 16 feet high in the dream. So he's very curious about this. So the next day, he asked his officials what was the meaning of this dream. And after listening to his dream, there was a scholar who said that it had been heard that in India, there was one called the Buddha, and this must be that God. See, I get this. Like I said, I don't read the fact. I'm like, okay, this is beautiful. I get this. So then he sends an envoy. I also want to apologize ahead of time. I am very poor with Chinese pronunciation, so I will try my best on the Chinese words that I have. I also wanted to give you as many geography pictures as I could, because I know that any of us that were born and raised in America, geography was not taught as well as in other areas of the world. So to give you some background, the emperor sent an envoy to Tianzi, but it's India. It's a name for ancient India, and it means the heavenly center. So there was an envoy who went to India to find out about these teachings of the Buddha. Any questions? Comments? And then Buddhist scriptures were said to have been returned to China on the backs of white horses, along with the arrival of 2 Indian monks and several Buddhist images. And apparently, after all this happened, Emperor Ming made the first Buddhist temple in China that is called the White Horse Temple. I had asked Patty if she had ever visited there. Have you ever visited there? No. The more research I did on it, it seems like we might want to take a road trip. It seemed like it would be a very beautiful temple to go to. According to the tradition, it's the first Buddhist temple in China, established around 68, under the patronage of Emperor Ming. He was so pleased with the arrival of these teachings and these monks that he built a temple in their honor, and he named it the White Horse Temple as an appreciation of the 2 white horses that had carried the 2 monks. And as you can see, I was trying to find a good picture of the temple, but I wanted to get the one where you can see the horses. And the monks, according to the tradition, resided in this temple, and they translated the Buddhist scripture into Chinese language. Amazing. I really feel like that would be an amazing visit. It is more, could you pronounce the name where it is? L-A, where the temple is located? It's, I can spell it Luo.
Luoyang.
And that is more west, am I correct? In more western China?
It's northwest of China. It's actually very close to Xi'an.
So it's not, in the most easiest place, to where some other things are, but that temple still exists. It's undergone very many changes. Well, wasn't there someone today who I want to make sure I'm not mixing up another talk, who was talking about the different changes of structures? Master. This is very similar as well. There's been very different changes in structure as the years have gone by. And recently, within the past 25 years or so, it sounds like it's had even more reconstruction. Now we move on to the historical account, and this is where it got extremely confusing, because there are many different historical accounts. They say there are some, now remember that was about 2,000 years ago, where the traditional account. This says there are some archaeological records that confirm that Buddhism was introduced sometime during the Han Dynasty, which is what the traditional account says as well. And there is a picture of the Han Empire, to give you an idea of where that was in relation to China. I need maps. I'm a map person. Generations of scholars have debated whether monks first arrived via the maritime route, which would have been a sea route, or over the land route of the Silk Road. I did not realize this. I assumed it was the Silk Road route, and I didn't know that was under debate. But the more research I was reading, there's been other historical scholars that say no, this was all happening through the seas. So this is a debate that has been going on for hundreds of years, how they arrived. The maritime route hypothesis is that Buddhism originally was introduced in southern China, in these 2 river regions, which I do have a picture on the map, on the next map, so you can see. Can you say it again?
Yangtze.
It sounded like a lot.
长江
Changjiang.
Yangtze River means 长江.
That was a river region. It's actually a smaller river that's in China, and I do have a picture of it on the map. On the next one, I'll show you on the next one. But it is believed on the historical account that there was a King Yang of Chu was worshiping the Buddha as well as other religious figures. This is also there's not a lot of information on this particular person, but if you do the research, he seems to be a very eclectic person. He was very interested in many different religions and how they could help himself and the members of his kingdom. It's very interesting to read about him. And this was circa 65. Do you want me to keep this on here? Oh,
I think I know where.
and here it is. If you can, I don't know if you can see on this map, I have it as well. The reason why this hypothesis is not being as accepted now is that they say they cannot find any direct evidence that Buddhism traveled via sea and water routes. Now, some are saying it's much harder to find evidence in the sea, which makes sense, as opposed to on the land. But this theory is not being accepted as much. Let's see if I, oh, that's right. Let me show you. It's a PowerPoint, not a presentation. Here is the Bly River. Can you all see that right there? Not, as you can see, a small, it wouldn't be known as a major river, probably not talked about very much in Chinese geography. Whereas I think we've all heard of this river.
Yes.
So they believe that it would start in southern China, through these rivers, or move up northern into this region also. Now there's a very interesting, now I'm going too far. For people who love to learn about history and culture and civilizations, while I was doing this research, I came across there are a group of people, Platnese, probably not saying that correctly, and they have a very interesting life. They started here and then did this whole westward expansion and almost ended up in an area of Afghanistan. Very interesting story. If anyone's ever interested, I can put that on the website. It was just a very small group of people who originated in that area. So as you can see, that would be the maritime route, but their scholars are now saying that they really don't have enough evidence, so they're not really accepting this theory as much. But we all know how that goes. They could end up finding, information in one of the rivers, and that can completely change. And then we have the overland, the overland route hypothesis, and that was that Buddhism disseminated eastward, and this would be through the Silk Road. It was originally practiced in Western China at the Han capital, which seems to go with the traditional account as well, because this was the area where Emperor Ming was located. So this does seem to correspond a bit with the traditional account as well. And it brought up in the historical account, this is where Emperor Ming established the White Horse Temple, approximately 68 CE. And they're saying that, as you brought up, that especially in the 1980s, that was a time where they start finding a lot of information that they did not have previously. They were able to find archaeological materials in Afghanistan. They were able to find first century Buddhist manuscripts. Were you all aware of this? I was not aware of this. It's amazing everything that they have found just in the 80s. And because of the historical texts, the materials, and the manuscripts that they've found since the 80s, they are very much believing now that the plausible theory is that Buddhism started in present-day area that is now partially Afghanistan and Pakistan and took all the land routes. There is a cave, yes. And I can't remember the name of the cave. Does anyone remember the name of this cave? There's a cave that they recently were able to get permission to go into, and they were able to stacks of manuscripts and actually even, not hieroglyphics, but information on the walls. I think that's the name of it. And they even found a picture in the walls of Emperor Ming and the whole dream. I mean, it's really interesting just within the 1980s, the information that they have found. And that is in China.
It's near the border with that, so it's within China now, but historically it was on the border.
And that was just recently. And I think you're correct, it was found, but they had to get the permission.
There were actually some manuscripts taken out of it about 100 years ago.
Okay. So very interesting. This is a really exciting information to get into. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, Afghanistan region was a part of China at that time or part of India?
I don't think so. I think it was Afghanistan region, but I believe there was quite a flourish of Buddhism in that area.
It was
correct?
The Mauryan Empire was the predominant empire. It was centered mainly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and ruled over large areas of Central Asia and parts of India.
And again, that's why they're thinking that Silk Road hypothesis is most likely the correct one, because there was a large percentage of Buddhists in Afghanistan as well as China.
In that time, the Afghanistan people still from the Greek.
Oh,
The Greek.
okay.
And then here is a picture of the red that you see on this picture is actually the portions of the main portions of the Silk Road, but then they also show how the sea routes would go that then would connect people to the road part of the Silk Road. It's really amazing how far it went. And the Silk Road, for anyone who doesn't know, I don't want to assume any of us know this, it's known as the historical network of interlinking trade routes, and it gets its name from the Chinese silk. And this also began during the Han Dynasty as well. Right, the original internet. That's a good way of saying that. It took a lot longer to get what you wanted, but you would get it. You would eventually get it. This is just some more information I found very interesting. I by no means wanted to overwhelm anyone, but I felt it was very interesting to what we were talking about. By the end of the 1st century, there was a Buddhist community in the Chinese capital of, and I misspelled that, but could you say that? I'm so Luoyang. And again, that's where Emperor Ming was. All the evidence seems to be going back to this area and this particular emperor. And then the other thing I read that was very interesting is that it didn't really begin to influence or really flourish in China until the 2nd century, where the Buddhist monks and translator missionaries from India and Central Asia began arriving in large numbers through the Silk Road, and then also by sea as well. Any theories on why you think that was the case?
Was that when the Muslims were invading?
I don't know.
Must have been 11 or 12.
Oh, that was much later.
Oh, could it be because Buddhism was being driven out of India?
Possibly. It seems,
I'm getting
yeah, no, it's possibly, yeah. I'm like, Sharon's giving us a preview of her next talk. It appears what the research is saying is that there just was not enough translation available. There just was not enough translation. So as these monks were able to translate, were coming to China, it then became more accessible to the Chinese, and then it began to flourish more. So it seems to point to. And then this was an interesting point that I had read. When I first read it, I didn't know if it was true right away, but I read it in 2 or 3 different accounts that the first Buddhist monks arrived with shaven heads, begging bowls and robes. These monks were traveling alone, sometimes in pairs, they didn't have homes nor families, and this was very confusing to the Confucian way of life, which was family, being around your family, being around your ancestor, producing heirs. So there was a little bit of confusion there on what were these monks doing? Why are they choosing to be away from their family? Family is very important. So that was taking some time as well. And then the earliest Buddhist monasteries in China were run primarily by Chinese-speaking Indians and Central Asians. And as their Chinese students matured, Chinese took over the monasteries and Buddhist texts were translated to Chinese. It is interesting if you put yourself in that time when these texts were first coming over, they were not Chinese. So I'm sure it does take quite a bit of time. Questions? So hard to have everybody after lunch. This is a map, I don't know if you can see it very well, to show where that capital city is that I'm talking about. Where the Han Dynasty and Ming built the Lighthouse Temple.
it really just makes me wonder like how they bridge the language. I mean, just, you know, you two people in a room who don't know the language that each of the other one is speaking. You're kind of at, you know, I mean, some of you travel and you experience that.
And then you think even more how often, this is what I appreciate so much more about Buddhism, you think how easy is it to translate some of the words that were written in the text from India? Do they have such an easy word in China that will directly translate to that?
So the dictionary definitions are
Right. I mean, how hard is that? For those of you that speak more than one language, how often does someone say, how do you say this word? And you're thinking, there's not really a word. So I mean, that's pretty amazing too when they come with these wonderful texts. And then the job is to translate it to Chinese. So it makes sense that all of this takes some time. And on that topic, we're moving on to the first. Thank you very much for that segue. The first documented translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese occurred in 148 with the arrival of the Parthian, and Parthia is a region in northeast Iran. With the arrival of the Parthian prince who was turned monk on Shigao. Sorry guys. I'm really trying. So another interesting character, if you would like to research, this is someone who was a prince and renounced and became a monk. And not only a monk, but a fantastic translator. So many of the Buddhist texts were translated by him. It's pretty amazing to think how one person really could have changed this whole direction. And he worked to establish Buddhist temples and organize the translations of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. And so many, and I don't know if you're going to be talking about this in your talk, but so many Indian Buddhist texts have been lost in the land of their origin, to where these Chinese as well as Tibetan translations have proven to be so valuable to other countries. So the fact that there were translations made in China as well as Tibet is extremely valuable for us to know more about this time period, because apparently in India so many of them cannot be found or may have been damaged. I don't know exactly what happens. And talking about translations, I had read in one of the books, and I'll put all this information on, the earliest translators had difficulty in finding the exact words to explain Buddhist concepts in Chinese, just like any of us would. So some of them tended to use the use of Taoist terms in their translations. As a result, people began to relate Buddhism with the existing Taoist tradition. And it was only later that the Chinese came to understand fully the teachings of the Buddha and how separate it was. He was a layman who worked alongside Anshigao and also translated a very early Mahayana Buddhist text on the Bodhisattva path. Not much information I could find on him. I was able to find very, very limited information, but I found his name in enough texts and website information to know that most of the time they would just say he was a layman who worked alongside him, and it started some of the Mahayana texts. But not very much information on him at all. Then Mahayana Buddhism was widely propagated in China by the monk. And these are some of the sutras that it's translated.
That's fun. not Chinese anyway.
It's not the Chinese.
So because he came from the kingdom of Gandhara,
Mhm.
and then the Satan.
And again, not much information on this, but according to several sources I found, the very first Mahayana sutras that they've been able to find have been from this person. So it goes back quite a ways. And that's it.
So like with Kenny's categorization, it's more like where something like this, is that like super like early, early Madonna?
What's the question again? Sorry.
So like where does, so something like this, that are really early translations of really early Mahayana sutras, then like in Caddy's map, where do they fall on your map? Does that mean it's like sort of like Madama, like early, like where does it fall on your map?
Oh.
You went even BCE
Yeah.
in yours. So she's asking where this particular time
Where
period
this-
would fall on your map that you have.
Come to second and third century, and
Okay,
her work
Not yet.
been translated.
Okay.
Right now, Ansukao already translate some of her work, but just in small part. They don't bring the whole collection to China because of the memory that they carry. Sometimes they can't translate it like that. They need to translate it like many sutra come to one. Just try to say something to the audience. One thing that why you mention so many times Lok Yang? Do you know why? In China, in that time, Xi'an and Lok Yang is similar in today's Washington D.C. and New York. Lok Yang is culture and merchant, and Xi'an is politics. That is two very important place in China, similar with the Rome and Greek.
About the same time as.
Yeah, at the same time in these two sides.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
so
Catholicism.
the professional and the high quality education people, they go two sides.
The second city that you named?
Xi'an.
Xi'an. How close was that?
Oh, not far away.
Not far.
Yeah, St. Washington and New York.
Train.
Not far away
Right,
from
train.
China.
I'm just thinking about our trip. I'm thinking of our next trip.
In answer to the question here, we should make a distinction between the Sanskrit word sutra and the Pali word sutta.
Yeah.
So the suttas and the original discourses of the Buddha, we'll talk about the sutras, which are later attributed to the Buddha, discovered and attributed to the Buddha. Okay, so that's a Sanskrit term. So it would not have been covered in the Caddy's suttas. Right.
Okay, we have a little bit of time left, so if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute or two and just making a couple notes on what you learned. This is for your benefit, for you to say, oh, okay, I learned some things today. Thinking about what you knew before you came in and now what you've learned since. These are for you to keep, and I'll put it, would you guys like a template of this on that site? Because it's a really nice way if you start doing your own research to put down the questions.
That would be good.